In the winter of 1891, in a drafty office of the Imperial Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, a physicist named Dmitri Sokolov was cataloging confiscated church documents when he discovered a leather-bound journal that contradicted everything he understood about medieval bell tower construction. The journal, seized from a monastery near Novgorod during secularization efforts, was dated 1347 and written in Old Church Slavonic. But the content was not devotional, it was technical. Page after page detailed mathematical calculations for bell tower heights, wall thicknesses, and opening dimensions, all expressed as ratios to specific musical frequencies. The calculations used concepts of harmonic resonance that would not be formally described in Western science until the work of Hermann von Helmholtz in the 1860s, more than 5 centuries later. Most troubling was a diagram near the journal's end, showing a bell tower in cross-section, with annotations marking resonance nodes at precise vertical intervals. The nodes were numbered with frequencies: 7.83, 14.1, 20.3, 27.3, values that meant nothing to Sokolov until he consulted recent geophysical research. They matched almost exactly the natural electromagnetic resonance frequencies of Earth's atmosphere, later formalized as Schumann resonances. A 14th century monk had documented knowledge that wouldn't be scientifically verified until the 1950s. Sokolov's report to the Academy, filed in March 1891, recommended further investigation into historical bell tower construction. The response, dated April 1891, thanked him for his diligence but noted that medieval craftsmen often incorporated numerological symbolism into religious architecture without scientific intent. The journal was archived. Sokolov's report was filed. Both disappeared into the Academy's collections, where they would remain until digitization efforts in 2007 brought them briefly to light before being re-archived as curiosities of limited historical interest. The official history of bell towers is straightforward. Medieval and Renaissance builders constructed them to house bells that marked the hours, called the faithful to prayer and warned of danger. The tower's heights were determined by practical concerns: visibility across the landscape, structural stability, and the acoustic projection needed to carry bell tones across distances. Architecture served function, form followed purpose. The towers rose because bells needed elevation to be heard. Yet across Europe and Asia, bell towers exist whose dimensions cannot be explained by these practical requirements alone. Towers built to heights that seem excessive for their locations. Wall thicknesses that vary in patterns serving no apparent structural purpose. Window and opening placements following geometric progressions that align with harmonic frequencies. And in rare cases where construction records survive, evidence of deliberate tuning, towers designed not just to hold bells, but to resonate at specific frequencies when those bells rang. On June 3, 1678, in Florence, the architect Vincenzo Viviani, a former student of Galileo Galilei, was commissioned to investigate cracks appearing in the Campanile di Giotto, the freestanding bell tower adjacent to Florence Cathedral. The tower, completed in 1359, stood 84.7 meters high, built of white, green, and red marble in geometric patterns. The cracks had appeared following the installation of a new bell, cast slightly heavier than its predecessor. Viviani's investigation, documented in a report preserved in the Florentine State Archives, revealed something unexpected. The tower's height of 84.7 meters was not arbitrary. When Viviani calculated the tower's fundamental resonant frequency, based on its dimensions and mass distribution, he found it corresponded precisely to the dominant frequency of the original bells, a relationship suggesting the tower had been designed as a resonator, not merely a support structure. The new bell, cast at a slightly different pitch, was creating interference patterns that stressed the masonry at points where the tower's geometry amplified certain frequencies. Viviani recommended either replacing the bell with one matching the original frequency or modifying the tower's upper sections to shift its resonant characteristics. The cathedral chapter chose to remove the new bell. The crack stabilized. Viviani's report was filed with other architectural documents, its implications about intentional acoustic engineering noted but not pursued. The tower's original designers had understood something about resonance that the 17th century craftsmen who cast the replacement bell had forgotten. In 1823, in Cologne, a German mathematician named August Leopold Krell was studying acoustic phenomena in cathedral spaces when he became interested in the relationship between bell tower architecture and the tones they produced. Krell, who would later found the influential Journal für die Rhein and Angewandte Mathematik, measured the dimensions of 17 bell towers across the Rhine region, documenting their heights, cross-sectional areas at different levels, and the frequencies of their bells. His findings, published in an obscure architectural journal in 1825, showed a pattern. The towers whose bells produced the most sustained, resonant tones, sounds that locals described as seeming to linger in the air long after the physical ringing stopped, were those whose heights corresponded to specific ratios of their bells' fundamental frequencies. The ratio appeared again and again. Tower height to wavelength of the bell's primary tone approximated 1.618 to 1, the golden ratio that appears throughout nature and classical architecture. But Krell found something else. In towers where multiple bells were hung at different heights, the vertical spacing between bells often followed harmonic intervals, musical ratios like 2 to 3 or 3 to 4, and these intervals aligned with the tower's structural geometry. Windows, buttresses, and internal floor levels appeared at heights that created acoustic nodes, points where sound waves would constructively interfere. The towers were not random structures, with bells added afterward. They were instruments, carefully tuned, with bells positioned to excite specific resonance modes. Krell's paper attracted brief attention among architectural theorists, but was largely dismissed by practical builders, who insisted tower designs followed structural and aesthetic traditions, not acoustic calculations. The paper was cited occasionally over the following decades, but prompted no systematic investigation. The knowledge Krell documented, if it reflected intentional design rather than fortunate accident, remained unexplained. On September 14, 1889, in the archives of Westminster Abbey in London, a clerk cataloging medieval building accounts discovered a set of construction specifications for the Abbey's bell tower, dating to 1252. The specifications, written in Latin with some Middle English annotations, describe the tower's dimensions with unusual precision. Heights were specified not in round numbers, but in fractions, measurements like 82 feet and 7 inches, no more, no less, suggesting exactitude that seemed excessive for medieval construction tolerances. More intriguing were marginal notes, apparently added by the master mason, describing acoustic tests conducted during construction. The notes mentioned lowering bells on temporary scaffolding to different heights and listening for the stone's voice, a phrase that appeared repeatedly. At certain heights, the notes indicated, the tower would sing with the bell and hold the tone like a vessel holds water. The specifications required the tower to be built to the height where this resonance was strongest, verified by tests conducted with the largest bell while the tower was still under construction. The clerk who discovered these specifications, Edmund Carlyle, wrote a brief article for the Abbey's historical bulletin, noting the unusual attention to acoustic properties in medieval construction. The article appeared in 1890 and was read primarily by antiquarians with interest in building history. Carlyle speculated that medieval craftsmen might have developed empirical knowledge of resonance through practical experience, even without formal scientific understanding. His observation was noted as interesting, but peripheral to the Abbey's architectural significance. The construction specifications were photographed for the archive and refiled. In 1902, in Kyoto, Japan, a seismologist named Fusakichi Omori was studying earthquake damage patterns when he noticed something peculiar about temple bell towers, called shoro in Japanese architecture. During the 1891 Nobi earthquake, one of the most devastating in Japanese history, temple bell towers had suffered damage patterns that didn't correlate predictably with ground shaking intensity. Some towers in areas of severe shaking remained intact, while others in less affected regions sustained significant damage. Omori's investigation, published in 1903, proposed that the tower's survival depended not just on structural strength, but on their resonant frequencies relative to the earthquake's predominant frequencies. Towers, whose natural frequency matched the earthquake's main shock frequency, were catastrophically damaged by resonance amplification. Towers whose frequencies were sufficiently different remained stable, even in intense shaking. This was expected physics. But Omori found something unexpected. When he measured the dimensions and calculated the resonant frequencies of towers built before 1600, during the late medieval and early modern period, their frequencies clustered in narrow ranges that avoided the most common earthquake frequencies in the region. Towers built after 1700, following different architectural styles influenced by Chinese and European designs, showed more random frequency distributions and correspondingly higher earthquake damage rates. The pre-1600 towers, Omori suggested, had been designed with implicit knowledge of earthquake resonance, possibly learned through centuries of observation of which tower designs survived and which collapsed. The knowledge was embedded in building traditions, specific proportions and construction methods passed from master to apprentice, without necessarily being understood as earthquake engineering. When those traditions were abandoned for aesthetic or cultural reasons, the protection was lost. Omori's work was primarily cited in seismology, where it contributed to early understanding of resonance in earthquake engineering. But his observations about pre-1600 Japanese bell towers being tuned to avoid earthquake frequencies attracted little attention from architectural historians, who viewed the correlation as likely coincidental rather than indicating intentional design. The question of how medieval Japanese builders would acquire such knowledge remained unaddressed. By the early 20th century, scattered observations from multiple disciplines, architecture, acoustics, seismology, mathematics, had documented anomalies in bell tower construction that suggested intentional frequency-based design. Yet these observations remained disconnected. Each was filed in its respective specialist literature, noted as interesting, but rarely cross-referenced. No unified investigation examined whether bell towers across different cultures and eras shared common acoustic design principles. In 1934, in Cambridge, England, an acoustician named Thomas Mather was researching architectural acoustics for his doctoral dissertation when he encountered Crelle's 1825 paper on Rhine bell towers. Intrigued, Mather expanded the investigation, measuring bell towers across England and comparing their dimensions to their bells' frequencies. He found the same patterns Crelle had documented: heights corresponding to golden ratios of wavelength, internal geometries creating acoustic nodes, structural elements positioned at harmonic intervals. But Mather went further. He analyzed the frequencies of the bells themselves and found they were not random. In towers with multiple bells, the bell's fundamental frequencies often formed harmonic series, mathematical relationships where each frequency is a simple multiple of a base frequency. The most common base frequency, appearing in about 30% of the towers Mather surveyed, was approximately 63 Hz, a low tone, barely audible, that the smallest bells would reinforce through harmonics. Mather calculated what a bell tower tuned to 63 Hz would look like. The optimal height would be approximately 84 meters for maximum resonance, remarkably close to the height of prominent medieval bell towers, including the Campanile di Giotto that Viviani had studied. The correlation seemed too consistent to be coincidental. Mather's dissertation, submitted in 1936, proposed that medieval bell tower builders possess sophisticated empirical knowledge of acoustic resonance, developed through centuries of observation and refined through tradition. His examiners accepted the thesis, but encouraged him to moderate his claims in any subsequent publication, noting that extraordinary claims about medieval technical knowledge required extraordinary evidence. Mather published a condensed version of his findings in 1938 in an acoustic engineering journal. The paper was cited occasionally, but generated no follow-up research. Mather joined the British wartime scientific effort in 1940 and never returned to the topic. He died in 1953. On November 18, 1962, in Prague, during renovation work on the Old Town Hall Tower, construction workers discovered a sealed chamber within the tower's masonry, approximately 40 meters above ground level. The chamber, roughly 2 meters square, contained objects that seemed to serve no structural purpose: copper plates arranged in geometric patterns, bronze rods of varying lengths suspended from the ceiling, and a wooden framework with marks suggesting it had held additional components now missing. The city's chief architect, Karel Novotny, examined the chamber and determined the copper plates and bronze rods formed what appeared to be acoustic resonators. devites destined to vibrate at specific frequencies. The bronze rods, when measured and analyzed, had lengths corresponding to harmonic fractions of the tower's height. The copper plates showed wear patterns suggesting long-term vibration. The chamber appeared to have been designed as a tuning mechanism, possibly to modify the tower's acoustic properties. Novotny's report, filed with the city's preservation office in January 1963, recommended preserving the chamber and its contents for study. Instead, the chamber was photographed, its contents removed and placed in storage, and the space was filled with modern concrete during tower stabilization work. The photographs survived in city archives. The objects were accessioned into a municipal storage facility and subsequently lost during reorganization in 1978. Only Novotny's report and the photographs remain, documenting a medieval acoustic mechanism whose purpose was never determined. In 1978, in Istanbul, earthquake engineers reinforcing the foundations of the Galata Tower discovered evidence that the medieval tower's construction had incorporated knowledge of resonance damping. The tower, built by the Genoese in 1348, stands 67 meters tall. During excavation around the foundation, engineers found a complex network of voids and chambers in the ground beneath the tower. Not storage spaces or cisterns, but empty volumes positioned at specific depths and distances from the tower's base. A Turkish structural engineer, Mehmet Alkan, recognized the configuration as similar to modern base isolation systems, where structures are protected from earthquake forces by layers that interrupt force transmission. But the Galata system was different. The underground chambers were positioned and sized to create acoustic impedance, resistance to sound wave propagation, at specific frequencies. The chambers would prevent certain ground vibrations from efficiently coupling into the tower structure. Alkan calculated which frequencies the system would block most effectively. The answer? Frequencies between 5 and 12 Hertz, the range where earthquake ground motion is typically most energetic. The Galata Tower had been built with a sophisticated earthquake protection system based on acoustic engineering principles, designed 6 centuries before modern seismic engineering developed similar concepts. Alkan's findings were published in a Turkish civil engineering journal in 1979 and presented at an international earthquake engineering conference in 1980. The paper generated discussion about medieval empirical engineering knowledge, but was largely viewed as an isolated example rather than evidence of systematic understanding. The question of how 14th century Genoese engineers would have known to design such a system remained unanswered. The paper was filed as an interesting historical footnote in the earthquake engineering literature. By the late 20th century, enough evidence had accumulated that patterns became undeniable to those who looked across disciplines. Bell towers from medieval Europe to feudal Japan showed design features suggesting intentional acoustic engineering. Heights corresponding to harmonic ratios, internal structures positioned at resonance nodes, foundation systems that manage frequency transmission, hidden chambers containing what appeared to be tuning mechanisms. Yet the knowledge remained fragmented across specialist literatures, rarely synthesized, and when noted, usually explained as fortunate accidents of traditional building methods rather than deliberate technical design. In 1995 at MIT, a graduate student in architectural acoustics named Jennifer Morrison decided to test whether medieval bell tower acoustics could be explained by coincidence or required intentional design. She created computer models of 50 documented medieval bell towers, inputting their measured dimensions, material properties, and bell specifications. She then ran simulations to determine what percentage of random tower designs of similar general scale would exhibit the acoustic properties the actual towers demonstrated. The results, published in her 1997 thesis, were striking. Less than 3% of randomly generated tower designs produced acoustic resonance characteristics matching those of the historical towers. The probability of the observed patterns arising by chance across independent building projects spanning different cultures and centuries was statistically negligible. The towers had been designed deliberately into specific acoustic specifications. Morrison's thesis proposed that medieval builders possessed practical knowledge of harmonic resonance, possibly learned empirically through trial and observation, and encoded that knowledge in building traditions expressed as geometric proportions and construction rules. The thesis was well received academically and earned Morrison recognition in architectural acoustics, but her findings were confined primarily to academic circles. No broader investigation was funded to examine why medieval builders would undertake such sophisticated acoustic engineering, or what purposes the precisely tuned bell towers were intended to serve beyond housing bells. On March 8, 2003, in Oxford, a historian of medieval science named Robert Fletcher was researching alchemical manuscripts when he discovered references to harmonic towers in a 13th century text attributed to Roger Bacon. The text, written in Latin with encoded passages, described towers built to capture and hold the music of the spheres, a phrase typically dismissed as medieval mysticism. But Fletcher noticed the text included specific architectural instructions, height ratios, wall thickness calculations, and positioning requirements that matched the acoustic engineering principles Morrison had identified. The manuscript suggested the towers served a purpose beyond timekeeping or religious ceremony. The encoded passages, when decrypted using period ciphers, described the towers as devices for harmonizing earth and heaven, possible metaphorical language for synchronizing structures with natural frequencies. References appeared to atmospheric resonance, to frequencies that move through air and stone alike, to towers that sing with the voice of the firmament. Fletcher's article on the Bacon manuscript, published in a medieval studies journal in 2004, noted the correlation between the manuscript's architectural specifications and actual bell tower designs, but cautiously avoided claiming the manuscript described intentional acoustic engineering. The article concluded that medieval natural philosophers like Bacon might have developed theoretical frameworks that influenced practical builders, creating a dialogue between philosophy and craft that produced architecturally sophisticated results without necessarily implying full scientific understanding. The article was cited occasionally in medieval studies, but generated no broader investigation. The Bacon manuscript remained one of many medieval texts describing the natural world in language that mixed observation with philosophy, its practical implications unclear. Today, bell towers built centuries ago still stand across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Their bells ring for tourism, for cultural ceremonies, for the pleasure of hearing ancient bronze voices echo across modern cities. Engineers maintain them, tourists photograph them, architects study them as examples of historical building techniques. The tower's heights are noted, their ornamental details admired, their ages recounted, but the frequencies remain. When restoration engineers measure bell towers for stabilization work, they find the acoustic characteristics Morrison documented: towers resonant at specific frequencies, internal geometries creating predictable acoustic nodes, foundation systems that manage frequency transmission, heights that correspond to harmonic ratios of their bell's tones. The evidence persists in stone and bronze, in structures that function as they were designed, though for what ultimate purpose? The official histories no longer remember. In 2019, in Barcelona, when Sagrada Familia's bell towers were being completed following Antoni Gaudi's original designs, acoustic engineers analyzing the plans discovered that Gaudi had specified tower heights and bell positions using ratios matching those found in medieval towers. Gaudi's notebooks from the 1880s included calculations of resonance frequencies and sketches of acoustic wave patterns within tower structures. The knowledge had survived, transmitted through architectural tradition, embedded in design rules about proportion and harmony. The bells that ring from ancient towers send frequencies through stone and air, frequencies that were calculated and calibrated by builders who understood resonance, even if they lacked the modern terminology to describe it. The towers stand as instruments precisely tuned, their notes sustained by architecture designed to capture and hold specific sounds. If history is written by those who remember, what happens to knowledge that survives only in the stones themselves, in structures that still function according to principles their builders understood but never formally recorded?